Have you ever seen someone who needed help? What did they need? Money? Or maybe a warm meal? Or perhaps just a little of your time? Let me tell you a little bit of my story before I start preaching. My name is Rebecca Miles. I'm 26 years old, unmarried, never been deeply in love, and I never thought a simple sidewalk conversation could change my whole life. I grew up in a small town called Brimley in northern Vermont. It was such a peaceful place that there wasn't a single petty theft in all the 10 years I lived there. Clean streets, neighbors always smiling at each other, and kindness seemed to be something natural, not something that needed to be taught. My family was middle class. Not rich, but we had enough. My mother was the kindest woman I've ever known. She taught me that helping others doesn't cost you anything, but it could give someone a whole day of hope. I carried that belief with me through college. I studied human resources, a major I thought would help me understand people and treat them right. After graduation, I decided to leave my hometown and move to Washington, D.C., the city of bright lights and endless opportunities. I wanted to grow up. I wanted challenges. I wanted to build something of my own. And like every coming-of-age story, my dream quickly ran into reality. My job at a mid-sized media company wasn't terrible, but it wasn't inspiring either. I sat in a glass office, handling paperwork, interviewing candidates trying to avoid internal conflicts that I didn't even understand. My co-workers were polite, but cold. My boss was kind, but distant. I started feeling like a machine. I lived alone in a rented apartment in Columbia Heights. Every morning I squeezed onto the subway, and every evening I dragged myself home, passing street corners where homeless people sat, shivering in the cold, holding cardboard signs that read, "I'm hungry," or "Help me buy medicine." At first, I would stop. I bought them sandwiches, coffee. Once I even gave a man my old sneakers because he was barefoot in the middle of winter. I never expected anything in return. I just wanted to help like my mother taught me. But then, everything changed. One time I saw the man who claimed he was sick and needed medicine get into a brand new Lexus right after he left the sidewalk. Another time, the person who said he lost everything in a house fire was wearing newer Air Jordans than mine and had Galaxy S5 earbuds. And then there was a woman who asked for money to buy diapers for her baby. Later, I saw her smoking and laughing loudly with a group of young people on the corner. I felt stupid. I felt betrayed. Not by them, but by the very kindness I used to believe was never wrong. After that, I changed. I started walking faster past those people, avoided their eyes, forced myself not to feel. I learned to stay silent, learned to shut myself off. Strange, isn't it? I once believed that kindness never loses its value. Yet just a few small shocks and I let it slip away. I told myself, this is a big city. To survive, you have to be practical, Rebecca. And I believed I was doing the right thing. I could sleep well, my wallet was safe, and my heart was no longer troubled. But I couldn't deny it. A part of me had started to feel empty. One day, while standing in the train station, I suddenly caught my reflection in the glass wall. A neatly dressed young woman, tired eyes clutching her bag tightly and lips pressed together as if trying to swallow something deep inside. I didn't recognize myself anymore. I, Rebecca Miles. Once the girl who loved smiling at strangers was now shrinking like a shadow in a city full of people. I knew I was drifting, but I didn't know how to find my way back. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Maybe someone to listen. Maybe something gentle but strong enough to make me stop and look at myself again. I never expected it would come from an old homeless man, someone who would later change my whole life. my job wasn't all that bad if you only looked at the paycheck and working hours. I didn't have to work night shifts, no one yelled at me harshly, and my salary was never unfairly cut. But some things can't be measured in money. A typical workday for me began with nearly 100 unread emails, waiting for me the moment I stepped into the office. Someone needed a contract, updated. Someone else wanted to rearrange departments. And then there were all the internal conflicts that, even though I had nothing to do with them, I still had to sit in the middle acting as the go-between. I listened, I nodded, I tried to mediate. No one said thank you. No one remembered me once their issue was solved. At lunchtime, I sat alone in the office kitchen. On the table was the lunchbox I had prepared the night before, and beside it was my phone, the only companion that talked to me throughout the hour. I used to think I would make a few friends here, but everyone had their own groups, their own conversations, their own worlds. I didn't want to intrude. Or maybe I had gotten used to standing on the outside. On weekends, I often lay on the sofa listening to psychology podcasts and writing short entries in my journal. I told myself, this is just a transition phase. Once things settle, everything will be different. But month after month, and now into my second year in DC, the feeling of being lost still stayed, like a coat I put on every morning. I missed Vermont. I missed the tree-lined streets, the neighbors who always greeted each other with genuine eyes. Back there, I didn't have to try so hard to feel seen. But here, I felt like I was fading. Every day, little by little. Every evening, I walked past the train station, where many homeless people took shelter. I saw the same scene so often that I started recognizing a few familiar faces. The old lady with silver hair who sat in front of the used bookstore. The red-haired man who always rested his head on an old suitcase, and the elderly man sitting quietly by the brick wall. He didn't hold a sign, didn't reach out his hand. He just sat still, his eyes calm and deep. I didn't know his name. I had never stopped. But somehow I began to look for him each day, wondering if he would still be there. He felt like part of the quiet scenery in this noisy city, a still point I didn't yet have the courage to approach. I asked myself, do I still have kindness left in me? That question haunted me every night. I was no longer the girl who once cried seeing a stray dog on the roadside. I was no longer the person who used to share half a sandwich with a stranger in the park. I had learned to avoid to protect myself. But deep down, I knew. I had lost something very important. One night, I woke up at 3 a.m. No car horns, no lights through the window. I lay still in the dark, listening to the beat of my heart. Steady, but cold. I wasn't afraid of being alone, but I was afraid of feeling invisible. I thought of my mother, her smile, and the words she once told me that stayed deep in my memory. Live your life in a way that someone is thankful you came into theirs. I stayed silent, because I couldn't remember the last time someone was truly thankful for me. The next morning, I still wore the same white blouse, slung my crossbody bag over my shoulder, and stepped out the door as usual. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't smile. I just walked, like every other day. As I turned onto the small street near the metro station, I saw the old man was still sitting there. But this time, he wasn't looking down at the ground like he usually did. He looked up, and he smiled. I froze. Young lady. His voice was deep but gentle like a soft breeze. It's a nice day to sit for a moment, isn't it? I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him. Those deep eyes, the kind smile, and a presence that felt like it had always been there. I slowed down, then stopped completely. And that was the moment I didn't know I was about to step into a conversation that would change everything. I don't know what made me stop. Maybe it was his smile. A smile that wasn't forced, wasn't begging, didn't carry any hope for help. Just a simple smile, as if I was the first person to walk by in days without turning my face away. I stood silently for a few seconds. A part of me said I should keep walking like always. But another part, the part I thought had been asleep for a long time, whispered, "Just for a little while. Sitting down for a moment won't cost you anything." I exhaled. A soft sigh, but one that felt heavy. Then I stepped closer and sat down on the steps beside him. He didn't look at me right away. Just let his eyes follow the flow of people rushing past. "Do you need any help?" I asked cautiously. He turned to me, eyes deep but bright, and shook his head. "No, young lady. I don't need anything today. I just thought you looked like someone who could use a little company." I paused. Not because his words were so surprising, but because they were so true. It made me feel exposed. How did he know I hadn't said a word, hadn't shown any emotion, besides the usual tired look? "You're not the first person to sit beside me," he continued. "But you're the first one I felt I should say that to." I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded. A short silence passed between us. Not awkward, not heavy. "What's your name?" I asked. "Wrigley," he said. "And yours, Rebecca. That's a beautiful name." He smiled. "Sounds like someone who shouldn't stay sad for too long." I let out a small laugh, the first I'd heard from myself in days. "So, do you sit here every day, pretty much?" "I like to observe. The world moves fast, but if you sit long enough, you start to see more than you expect." I nodded, then went quiet. There was something in the way he spoke, unhurried, without effort, that made me feel safe. Not physically, but emotionally. As if even if I said something deeply personal, he wouldn't judge. And so I did. Not in long stories, not in a rush, but I told him. About the job that drained me. About the city that made me feel small. About the people I had once tried to help only to get hurt. About how I no longer knew what was right anymore. He listened. Never interrupted, never gave advice like most older people do. Just nodded sometimes or let out a soft breath. "I used to believe kindness always had value," I said, looking down. "But now, I'm not sure anymore." He was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke slowly. "Sometimes people don't need to know what you've done. It's enough that you know it was right." I looked up at him. That simple sentence, strangely ordinary, made my chest tighten. Maybe because it was the first thing in a long time that actually eased my heart. "Thank you," I said. "No need," he replied. "You sat down. That's enough for me." I looked at my watch. Nearly 20 minutes had passed. I stood up, reached for my wallet, and started to offer him some money. Out of habit. He shook his head. "I don't need money today. Just this conversation." I put my wallet away, smiled, truly smiled, and said, "I hope you'll still be here next time. I'll be here if you ever need to sit again." I nodded, then turned to leave. My steps were lighter. My heart felt lighter, and the city seemed just a little softer. I didn't know it yet, but from that moment on, I had begun a journey I never could have imagined. I came back, not because I felt responsible or because I thought I should do something. I came back because I wanted to. Plain and simple. It was a Wednesday. I got off work earlier than usual. The weather wasn't sunny, but it wasn't rainy either. That kind of soft, mild weather I've always liked. I walked slowly along the familiar street, and from a distance, I saw him. Still in that old, worn-out blue sweater, still sitting at a slight angle by the wall, and still with those eyes gazing far away, as if watching a world that didn't belong to this one. I walked closer. He looked up, and there it was, that smile like he had already known I would come back. "Young lady," he said, "I suppose it's another beautiful day today." I chuckled and sat down beside him, no hesitation this time. "You're still here, and you're still walking by," he replied, softly. We didn't talk much at first. A calm silence settled over us. The air felt thick but not heavy, like the pause between two musical notes, making the next sound ring clearer. After a bit of small talk, about the weather, about the roadworks nearby, I asked, "Have you eaten yet?" He paused for a moment, then shook his head. "A little hungry, but I'm used to it." "Well then, let me treat you to a proper meal today." He looked like he was about to refuse, but I stood up first and looked back at him, saying, "I'm not asking for permission. I'm inviting you." I took him to a small diner 2 blocks away, a place I often went to when I wanted something simple like hot chicken soup or buttered toast. The server looked at us with slight curiosity, but didn't show any attitude. I ordered 2 of the same, chicken soup and ham sandwiches. When the food arrived, Mr. Wrigley sat up straight and used his spoon slowly with care. Every bite was like a small ceremony, not rushed, not wasteful. I watched quietly. There was something in the way he held that bowl of soup that touched me deeply, as if to him this meal was a gift, not because of the food, but because of the presence. "Thank you," he said softly, after a few minutes of silence. "It's nothing," I smiled. "I needed someone to eat with, too." He nodded. "I don't have many people to share a meal with anymore. But I used to." "You had a family?" "I had a good wife and a son," he replied, his voice lowering. "Now, they're both somewhere else, in different ways." I didn't ask more. Not because I wasn't curious, but because I could feel. Some things don't need to be told in full for someone to understand. "What about you?" he asked. "Family here?" "No, I'm alone. My parents passed away. Friends. They all have their own lives. I don't blame them. In the end, everyone has to look after themselves first." He nodded, slowly. I looked down at my soup and said, almost like an exhale, "I used to think that if I just lived kindly, good things would come. But kindness doesn't protect me from loneliness. It doesn't stop disappointment." "No," he said gently. "Kindness isn't meant to get you anything. It's there to keep you from becoming someone you're not." That sentence made me pause. I didn't say anything. I just sat in silence for a long time. When we finished eating, I pulled a small slip of paper from my purse and wrote my phone number on it. "In case you need anything," I said, "just call me." He took the paper as if receiving something precious, not because of its value, but because of its meaning. "Thank you, Rebecca," he said, using my full name for the first time. "You're the first person in years to offer me a meal." Not out of pity. I didn't know how to respond, so I just smiled. When we parted, he didn't say, "See you again," but I knew. If I came back, he would still be there. And I knew for sure that I would come back. The key turned gently in my hand as I stepped into my apartment. The sky outside had dimmed, and the streetlights cast a glow through the window just enough that I didn't turn on the lights. I sat down at my desk, the soft yellow lamp lighting up the empty surface. In my mind, Mr. Wrigley's words kept echoing. "If you ever want to sit again, I'll still be here." I didn't know if he still remembered me, but I remembered him. I remembered how for the first time in years, someone truly listened to me. His words and the way he quietly listened circled through my thoughts. I had forgotten about my own soul for a long time, something he somehow helped me find again. And I wondered, could someone else out there need this story too? I opened my laptop. The living room was dim, with only the soft light from the street outside, and the air was a little chilly. I began to write. I spoke with an old homeless man on the steps by the sidewalk. He didn't ask for money. He just said, "You don't have to trust everyone. Just don't stop believing in yourself." A small moment, but it made me feel maybe I hadn't lost everything after all. I didn't think I would post the story online. But that night, sitting alone in my quiet apartment, I kept thinking about Mr. Wrigley's eyes. Those eyes that seemed to see right through me, yet held no judgment, only kindness. I picked up my phone and wrote a short post. The words weren't polished, just an honest flow of feeling. I shared it in a small community group for book lovers and people who valued kindness and humanity. I added a photo, a quick shot I had taken when I left. He was still sitting in his usual spot, the evening sun gently resting on his silver hair. I included his name, Wrigley, just as he introduced himself. No last name, no other details, only Mr. Wrigley, the man with the eyes that listened. I didn't expect anything. But within just a few hours, the notifications started coming in. The first comments appeared. "Thank you for reminding us that kindness matters." This post brought tears to my eyes. I once had a Mr. Wrigley in my life, too. By the next morning, I woke up in shock. The post had been shared thousands of times. A few people from nearby communities reposted his photo saying they had seen him sitting by a different street corner or quietly passing by the old church. I read each comment smiling through misty eyes. Kindness. It turns out still has a place as long as someone reminds us of it at the right moment. I added a short update. If anyone knows who Mr. Wrigley is, please let me know. I just want to say he helped someone find trust again. Somewhere else, dozens of blocks away from me. Daniel R. Davis, CEO of a major media corporation, was working late in his office, still lit through the night. He usually didn't spend time on social media, but that day his communications assistant had sent him a link with a message. "You might want to read this, sir. It could matter to you." He opened his phone and began reading the post mindlessly. But when he saw the attached photo, the man sitting by the sidewalk, faded blue sweater eyes gazing far into the distance, his heart stopped. Those eyes, that posture, there was no mistaking it. "Dad," he whispered. The whole world around him went quiet for a few seconds. He sat in silence. Among the numbers, the slides, the urgent CEO messages, he scrolled to the final lines again. A small moment, but it made me feel like maybe I hadn't lost everything. He stood up, reread the post again and again. 10 years of searching for his father. He thought his heart had gone numb. But today, just a photo and a single sentence were enough to make that heart beat again in a strange and vivid way. He took a screenshot of the post, saved it into a personal folder, then added a note tagged with Dad, Mr. Wrigley. Must find. He decided he had to go there. Early the next morning, he drove through the streets of Washington, heading to the area where the homeless often gathered. He didn't arrange anything in advance. He wanted to see for himself. He wanted to face it on his own. Back at my apartment, I was having breakfast thinking the story had ended when I posted it. But inside me was a strange kind of energy. I wondered, could that small moment reach others the way it reached me. What I didn't know was that somewhere a man was reading every line, every emotion, and deciding to do something he had never considered before, to go find his father. I kept staring at my screen. The post had spread far beyond the small group. Strangers from nearby communities to across the city were sharing and echoing the story. One person even wrote, "I'm helping to look for him. If anyone recognizes him, please let us know." I sat silently. What I felt first was connection from such a small story that now seemed to be healing other souls. I saw him yesterday, near the corner of 14th Street NW and U Street NW, and they attached a small photo of the old man looking down at the ground. My hands trembled as I stared at the picture, the way he sat the sweater, the distant look in his eyes. It was so familiar, I didn't dare breathe. I didn't know where this was leading me, but I knew I had stepped into a new chapter where life no longer felt solitary because someone else was now walking through the same story with me. And in that moment, I, Rebecca Miles, no longer felt apart. I had planted a small seed of kindness, and it had begun to grow. Daniel stared at the post on his phone screen, the photo of the old man sitting sideways on the edge of the sidewalk, that thoughtful look in his eyes, the faded gray sweater. There was no mistake. It was him. It was his father. The man he had spent 10 long years searching for in a world too vast and too cold. No more doubts, no more waiting. Daniel jumped to his feet, leaving his office without taking anything except the photo on his phone and a heart pounding wildly in his chest. He drove straight to the intersection of 14th Street NW and U Street NW, the place mentioned in the post. The early sun lit up the pavement. He scanned the area, and then he saw him. At the corner beside a faded brick wall was that familiar figure. Silver hair slightly tilted, posture eyes gazing into nowhere, as if he had been sitting there for a long time. Daniel walked slowly, holding his breath with each step. As he got close, he whispered, "Dad." Mr. Wrigley looked up, and his clouded eyes suddenly lit up. They looked at each other. No tears, no sobs. Just 10 years of silence pressing between them. Daniel sat down beside him and showed him the photo from the post on his phone. "I saw you here," he said, his voice hoarse. The old man nodded gently, not turning away. "I searched everywhere for you," Daniel continued. "Since the day you left, I haven't lived a single day in peace." Mr. Wrigley didn't respond right away. Then he spoke, his voice dry and worn with time. "I didn't leave, son. I just didn't know if I still had a place in your life." And they started to talk. Words never spoken. The story from 10 years ago when Daniel took over the media company his father had built, a small company once driven by values and human-centered ideals. Daniel, full of youthful ambition, wanted to scale up, partner with big brands, and build an influential entertainment platform. Mr. Wrigley strongly opposed it, believing Daniel's vision would slowly dilute the ethical foundation he had spent his life building. Arguments grew, heated. Words were thrown back and forth. Until one day, Mr. Wrigley walked away without saying goodbye. "I thought that if you could succeed that way," he said softly, "then it was better for me to disappear. I didn't want to be a burden." Daniel lowered his head. "I was wrong. I needed you. I needed someone to remind me to keep my humanity in every decision I made." Mr. Wrigley gave a faint smile, his eyes a little wet. "And then a kind young woman reminded me that kindness isn't dead." Daniel paused, stunned. "Rebecca," he said. He nodded. "She gave me a meal, a conversation, without asking who I was or what I needed. Daniel looked at his phone, pointing to the post. She wrote this. She touched your heart. He looked at the picture. And you, because of her, found your father. Daniel stayed silent. A wave of emotion washed over him, hard to name. Gratitude, respect, and curiosity. He asked his father about her, about the way she listened, the way she shared. His father simply replied, someone who isn't afraid of being hurt. Someone who dares to see another person's pain. That evening, back at his office, Daniel opened the company's internal database. With just a few clicks, he found out that Rebecca worked in the HR department of one of the subsidiary companies under his corporation. She had no idea. He sat quietly in front of the screen. He didn't want to send a thank you email. He didn't want to show up as the CEO. He wanted to understand her truly, to know whether she had any other reason for helping the homeless, or if it was all just real. And so Daniel came up with a bold idea. He requested to go on site at the subsidiary company under the title of a temporary IT technician on the pretext of reviewing and improving their internal management system. A week later, the file for Dan, temporary IT staff, was sent to Rebecca's office. And on an ordinary Monday morning, Rebecca met Dan for the first time, a tall man, calm, soft-spoken, and always smiling whenever their eyes met. She had no idea that this new colleague had once sat crying in silence upon seeing the photo of his father in the post she had written. And from that day on, the story was no longer just about kindness shown to a homeless man. It had become an invisible thread, quietly connecting 3 lives through fate, through redemption, and through belief. Back to my story. I still remember it was a Monday morning. Just as I walked through the IT department door, I heard a small announcement. There's a new IT staff member named Dan. In my mind, I simply thought just another tech support guy. But when he walked in tall, calm, with a gentle smile like a breeze, my heart skipped a beat. We didn't say much the first time we met, just a simple question. Are you having any trouble with your email? And a soft reply from me. Not really, just a bit slow, which makes things a bit inconvenient. He quickly adjusted a few settings, then smiled. All set. Give it a try. After that, he turned to leave, but from that moment on, I no longer felt invisible in the IT room. In the days that followed, he started appearing near where I ate lunch. He always seemed to pick a table close to mine. He never started the conversation, but whenever I ordered coffee or went to get water, he somehow ended up beside me or smiled when I looked up by accident. I didn't know why. I just knew someone's presence made me feel at ease again. A feeling I hadn't had in a long, long time. A close friend asked me, "Why do you look so happy these days?" I just laughed and said, "It's nothing." But the truth was I was beginning to feel something. One autumn afternoon, Dan showed up with a small tray. "No light lunch today," he said, placing a simple salad and bread in front of me. I was surprised. I had never told him I liked salad. He just smiled and softly said, "I thought you could use some energy." I smiled back, letting my gaze linger a bit longer than usual. Someone like me, often cautious with emotions, was beginning to soften. Because he wasn't loud. He wasn't showy. He was simply there, passing through my life like light, through a thin curtain just enough for someone to see their own quiet fragility and strength. Another day, I told him about the post I had written about Arthur Mr. Wrigley, a man I had invited to lunch, a man who helped me reconnect with kindness. I shared how relieved I felt when he said, "If you ever want to sit again, I'll still be here." I told Dan about the moment I wrote the post and how quickly it spread so fast I couldn't keep up. He listened quietly. then said just one thing very gently. You did the right thing. No judgment, no questions. Just like a calm mirror reflecting both my doubt and my hope. I didn't know then that he had another life behind that smile, a hidden world of inner conflict, pain, regret, and a truth he was holding back. I watched him, quietly, place my favorite coffee in front of me, saying, I remember you, like it's strong. Even though I'd never told him that. He smiled with a quiet knowing, I just want you to feel comfortable. And somehow I understood he was trying to create ease not just for me, but for himself too. I don't know exactly when I started thinking Dan wasn't like anyone else I'd ever met. He felt like someone I trusted, even though I didn't truly know who he was. At first, I thought it was just a fleeting warmth. But day by day, it became something more solid, like a brick laid gently one at a time. A quiet kind of trust being built. One afternoon, he asked me, would you like to take a walk after work? It wasn't the way he asked that moved me, but how he showed care. Not with words, but with his quiet presence. I said yes. We walked by the riverside, under the yellow-leafed pui trees. We didn't need to talk much, just eyes meeting now and then, and unspoken questions about learning to trust again. I told him about the long nights I'd spent alone in the city, how everyone always seemed in a rush with something to do, but never time to listen. There were days I felt like I was drifting unnoticed. He listened silently, then said, this city sometimes needs someone who knows how to pause and actually see it. I laughed. So who is Dan in this heavy city? He turned to me, his eyes soft. Just someone trying to understand you. And I knew something important had begun. I didn't want him to leave. I wasn't sure if he was hiding something, but sometimes his silence left me unsettled. As if there was still a thin curtain between us, not quite distance, but not full honesty either. I sensed there was something left unsaid, and I started to feel afraid that if I opened my heart too quickly, maybe he would disappear too, just like those I once believed truly cared. I didn't have direct questions. I just knew that whenever he came near, my heart felt lighter, even if I didn't yet understand why. I told my best friend. Lately, there's someone who makes me believe in real kindness again. And she said, take it slow. Kind people usually carry beautiful things. I stayed quiet, because I too was still learning how to wait. And the greatest unknown of all was this Dan. The man I was slowly letting into my heart was the same man who had once cried, seeing a photo of his father in the post I had written. The one who quietly went to find him. The one who chose to love by stepping gently into my world. And now that very person was stitching my heart back together piece by piece with small, honest gestures. The story was no longer about a post or a shared meal. It had become a story about giving trust and the longing to be loved truthfully in a city so wide, sometimes cold, yet still spacious enough for an invisible thread to connect three lives through kindness, through redemption, and through the return of faith. Since Dan came into my life with that gentle smile, I no longer felt alone in this vast city. We slowly became part of each other's routine, especially during lunch. He would quietly place a sandwich from the little shop near our office, the kind he knew I liked, and smile softly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Gradually, our conversations moved beyond work. He spoke of dark nights of loss, of finding trust on the streets, but always kept something bigger hidden inside. I told him about my mother, who passed away when I was young, and how I had lived 10 long years not daring to trust anyone until I met a homeless man named Wrigley. He said nothing, only looked at me in silence, then lowered his head slightly, as if he understood the part of the story I still kept inside. Many times I found a hot cup of ginger tea waiting on my desk with a small note. Take a moment to breathe. Another time, he gave me a pastry, my favorite kind, even though I had never told anyone. Those tiny, quiet gestures stirred something in me I thought had long died. I was beginning to fall in love. One autumn afternoon, as the cold breeze pushed golden leaves past the office window, he asked if I wanted to take a walk by the river. I said yes, without hesitation. The sunset poured gently through the lines of pui trees. We sat side by side on the wooden bridge in silence. I rested my head on his shoulder. The feeling of complete trust, like putting on an old coat you hadn't worn in years and finding it still fit perfectly, made me feel safer than ever before. Another evening, he surprised me with tickets to an outdoor classical concert where violin notes floated into the soft night sky. We sat on a small blanket on the grass near the drifting music. I leaned into him. He gently placed his hand on mine. No words, no promises. Yes, I realized I had fully fallen for him, but even in those tender eyes, I could still sense an emptiness, a quiet space between us that made me uneasy. One night, I asked, "Have you ever truly loved someone?" He gave a small smile, but didn't answer, and I knew he was waiting for something bigger before breaking the fragile dream we were living in. I didn't blame him. I just feared that space between us might one day hurt me if he chose to walk away. On our way home that evening, he spoke softly. "If one day I changed, would you still believe in me?" I turned to look at him under the soft streetlight, my eyes holding both trust and doubt. As long as that person still has these eyes. He gave me a quiet smile. I asked myself, would he ever be brave enough to tell the truth, so I could love him not only with feeling, but with truth? But I also knew he was fighting a battle inside, between holding on to his Dan identity and a truth powerful enough to burn the future he thought was safe. I didn't push. I didn't demand. I just quietly gave him time the same way I once gave myself time to find trust again through Mr. Wrigley's words. Because I believe if love is the only thing that remains certain, then trust must come from the most honest thing someone can give. So I kept sitting at the IT lunch table, sharing a few nameless stories. And in that silence, I felt we were building something real, even if still unspoken. An invisible thread between two people woven through kindness, through his gaze, and through the trust we were gently learning to grow again. That night, the stone bench by the Potomac River trembled slightly under the soft yellow glow of the streetlights. Dan placed the cup of ginger tea I liked gently into my hands, then sat down beside me. The space around us was quiet, with only the sound of water flowing nearby. I began telling him about Mr. Wrigley, the homeless man I had once met. I told him how he never asked for anything, only listened to me like I was the only person worthy of being heard. How he once said, "If you ever want to sit again, I'll still be here." Those words softened something in me after months of holding myself tightly shut from the world. I told him about the simple meal we shared and the warmth of a man who smiled without expecting anything in return. Dan listened in silence. His eyes glistened as if he was seeing a piece of my childhood, and also perhaps a glimpse of his own father through my words. He asked softly, "Did he ever say anything about his family?" I looked into the distance. He said he once had a son he hoped would stay on the right path. But he said that son left him a long time ago. Dan looked at me, his voice breaking slightly. Uh, he didn't finish the sentence. But I understood. He was thinking about his father. A week later, I saw Dan rushing out of the office early. Before he left, he said, "Tonight I have somewhere I need to be. I've found someone I haven't seen in a long time." I simply smiled. That night, like every other night, I wrote in my journal. I wondered about the beautiful coincidence that touched both our hearts. Dan and I were both people who had been helped by someone nameless, sitting on the edge of the street just to listen. The next morning, Dan returned as if nothing had happened. But his eyes were brighter. He asked if I wanted to go somewhere over the weekend. We chose a quiet tea shop tucked into a small alley. He led me to a window seat that looked out onto blooming apricot blossoms glistening in the early mist. The air was cool and fresh. He asked me if I was happy. I looked at him, smiled softly, and nodded. Later that afternoon, I saw his phone light up. A message from Dan read, "I told my father about you. I told him the woman who helped him find his way back was you." The next message was a photo he'd taken. A silhouette of Mr. Wrigley sitting again on that same old step, silent but more steady now. No more words were needed. My heart stirred again with a larger kind of trust. As evening fell, we walked once more by the river. Candlelight from a nearby outdoor concert drifted gently in the background. The atmosphere was quiet, listening. I spoke. "You told him everything?" Dan looked at me, eyes tender. "Yes. I told him everything." He held my hand lightly but firmly. He said, "If I'm going to love someone with my whole heart, I can't hide who I am." I felt a lump in my throat. Though Dan and I had fallen in love, nothing had been officially said. No confirmation, no proposal. The love between us still lived in the space between gestures. I saw the sincerity in his eyes as he added, "I'm afraid. If I tell you the truth right now, we might lose what we have." I fell quiet, thinking about all the broken pieces I had once buried because I trusted the wrong people. But now warmth was blooming, and I knew I had to open up. "Are you afraid I'll leave if I know who you really are?" I asked. He went still, then softened. "No. Not if you know me and still choose to stay." My heart eased. A light drizzle began to fall soft like quiet footsteps in the night. I leaned my head on his shoulder, and in that gaze, just that one look, I knew. If truth meant we could stay together with open hearts, then I was ready to face it. With him. I still can't explain how an ordinary afternoon could become such a turning point in my heart. But that day, when Dan brought me to the small park by the Potomac River, in the crisp air of early winter, I knew something was beginning. He had prepared a small blue checkered blanket laid gently over the damp grass. On it were a box of sandwiches, some fruit, and 2 steaming cups of hot tea. It wasn't a fancy place. No sparkling lights, just a shaded patch on pale green ground. Yet I felt warm, like being protected by someone for the very first time. He smiled when he saw me sit down and poured the tea. "It's cold, isn't it?" I nodded softly without a word. We sat side by side, neither of us in a rush, just the warmth rising from our tea and the sound of wind gently rustling through the trees. I no longer saw the vast city beyond, only a quiet space, still and calm, and Dan sitting beside me suddenly stood up. He stepped slightly away from the picnic blanket, then turned to face me. "Rebecca?" He said my name, his voice deeper and more serious than usual. My heart slowed, sensing something was coming. He knelt down in front of me. I froze. My hands trembled slightly as I saw him take out a small black velvet box from his coat pocket. He opened it. Inside was a simple but elegant silver ring glowing in the soft twilight. "I don't have a castle," Dan said, his voice a little shaky. "No fireworks, no orchestra. Just one thing I'm sure of. I can't imagine a single day in my life without you in it." He looked at me as if my silence might break his heart into pieces. "Rebecca Miles. Will you marry me?" I don't know when the tears started falling. My heart paused, then leapt. Everything around us disappeared. There was only him and the proposal that left me breathless. I nodded gently. "Yes, I will." Dan exhaled in relief, then smiled so brightly, like a child. He slid the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly. There were no witnesses, no applause. But inside my heart, it felt like 1,000 people cheering. I sat down, embraced him, and whispered, "Thank you for being brave enough to love truthfully." We stayed there until the last of the light faded from the sky, long enough for me to realize that from that moment on, I was no longer someone searching for warmth. I had found it in Dan's arms. On the way home, we held hands, a kind of promise, wordless, that neither of us would walk alone again. I didn't know who Dan was outside of the man beside me at that moment, and honestly, that was enough. Whatever he told me tomorrow, I knew I wouldn't let go, because I had chosen the sincerity in him, not the appearance, not the title, but his heart. And if something called destiny exists, then perhaps it was that very afternoon, among scattered golden leaves and warm ginger tea, where a love story quietly began. From one small act of kindness toward a homeless man long ago, I never imagined I had already taken the first step into something so much greater. A journey that in the end brought together 3 seemingly unrelated lives through kindness, through things unspoken, and through a love deep enough to change everything. I stepped into the Grand Hotel lobby, and for the first time, I felt like I was lost in another world. High ceilings, dazzling golden lights, well-dressed guests, and servers bowing politely. I was a little overwhelmed. In my head echoed the thought, is this really a family introduction? Dan. Is this really the kind of place a girl like me gets invited to? We were seated at a private table by the window overlooking the city. I guessed this was an overly luxurious choice for what was supposed to be an informal meeting. The waiter arrived with a polite smile, handing us napkins. My heart fluttered a little, stirred by a vague unease. I leaned over and whispered to Dan, "You don't have to do this for me. I'm not used to places like this. We could have had something simpler, more modest." Dan looked at me gently, his face tinged with a quiet sadness, though he still smiled. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you earlier. There's something I've been hiding." He stood up, pulled out his chair softly, and looked deep into my eyes. "This hotel and the building across the street, they're both mine." I froze. I thought he was joking. For a moment, I searched his face for any sign of playfulness, a teasing look, a half smile like he often gave. But no. He looked at me with such seriousness that even the cool air from the AC felt colder. My heart sank, like it was being lowered into still water, not crashing, just drowning in complete silence. I turned away, looking around the restaurant as if hoping to find something that would comfort me. But nothing had changed. Still the soft golden lights, the gentle piano in the background, the delicate shimmer of wine glasses, and Dan watching me with eyes that had nothing left to hide. When the waiter returned, bowed respectfully, and said, "Enjoy your dinner, sir." the owner. Everything clicked in my head like hundreds of puzzle pieces dropping into place at once. The quiet looks, the small hesitations, the moments when he almost said more, but didn't. For a few seconds, I didn't know how to react. I just stared at Dan in confusion. Not because I was afraid of his wealth, not because I felt unworthy, but because I had trusted him. Trusted him so much I had never once questioned. Never once asked who he really was. Then Dan stood and gently led another man to our table, a man with silver hair and slightly slumped shoulders. I knew instantly. It was Mr. Wrigley. He was still wearing that old blue sweater, and his eyes still held the same familiar warmth. I jumped to my feet, unable to hold back my emotions. I ran to him and hugged him tightly. "Are you well, sir? I've been looking for you." But my words caught in my throat. He gently stroked my hair, then looked toward the small table. "I'm doing well, thanks to everything you've done." Tears streamed down my cheeks. Not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet sense of relief between us, like a wound finally healing. Dan sat down beside me, his voice choked with emotion. "Dad, and Rebecca is the one who brought you back into my life." I turned to look at him. He stepped closer, speaking to both his father and me. "You wrote the post. You didn't know, but that post led me to find him." His father looked at me for a long moment, then smiled gently. "You once said that if you're going to love someone with your whole heart, you shouldn't let them love only a shadow. I think she reached your heart with the most honest part of herself." I was overwhelmed. I stammered. "I just never thought I could do something that big." Dan placed my hand in his father's. No one ever knows when a simple meal or a quiet conversation might mend a broken heart. But you did. The air was nearly silent, but in the warmth of our breath and the faint scent of afternoon tea still clinging to the napkins, I felt something undeniably real. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a moment that redefined my heart. How to love, how to trust, and how to accept. His father turned to me, eyes full of affection. "I once thought the path I chose was the right one, but now I understand what truly lasts is what preserves our humanity between each other." I smiled through tears because I knew I wasn't just being loved. I was being seen, valued, respected in full truth. By a man who could have hidden who he was, but never hid his sincerity. Dan bowed his head slightly, then looked at his father and me. "Thank you for giving us this day." I looked at them, both eyes red and glistening. There was no applause, no stage, no audience, but it was powerful enough to mark a new chapter for my whole life. After the evening at the restaurant, I returned home with a heart full of emotion. Dan texted me gently. "My father and I would love to invite your family to Colorado this weekend. Just a small getaway so both sides can get to know each other." I hesitated for a moment. My heart was filled with honest uncertainty. My father wasn't used to fancy places. My little sister was thrilled, and my mother had long since passed. Just my father and I remained. But still, I replied, "We'd love to." The trip began on a softly sunny day. My father, my younger sister, and I stepped off the plane in Colorado mountains, rising in the distance. Dan and his father were already waiting at the arrivals terminal with bright smiles. Mr. Wrigley gave me a gentle hug, then turned toward my sister. "She's like a small model of Rebecca." My sister blushed, lowering her head with a shy smile. And just like that, I felt every distance that had once existed quietly dissolve. We headed to a small resort by the lake. That first night sitting around the fire pit, We shared stories about our hometown Vermont, about life in DC, and about why some people must leave before they can find their way back. My father spoke of my mother, how she lived kindly until her final day, and how she would surely be smiling if she saw me now. Mr. Wrigley nodded quietly, as if he too could see the little things that carried great meaning. The next morning, I woke in a warm hotel room nestled in the Colorado mountains. Morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting golden light across a card Dan had left beside a steaming cup of ginger tea. "Good morning, future bride." I laughed aloud, heart brimming with emotion. Though I hadn't yet breathed in the crisp mountain air, my soul was already full of peace and hope, because today we were beginning a new chapter, our first family trip, just as he had promised. The following day was an outdoor picnic, a gentle hike through the hills ending by a frozen stream. Dan held my hand across slippery stones, while my sister joyfully tossed pebbles into the water. Our fathers sat side by side, the sound of the flowing stream around them, sharing fragments of memories lost to 10 years apart, slowly, quietly rediscovering common ground. After that, we played a game of tent building on the soft grass and lit a small campfire. That night was our firelight storytelling, where both families wished one another good health, love, and that kindness would always remain. I felt like part of something far bigger than myself, a story of human connection, where two once distant families came together through honesty and kindness. On the final day before returning to DC, Dan and his father took my dad and little sister to the ice rink. They handed me a blanket laid beside Dan and looked at me with eyes full of emotion. "Thank you for giving us a family." I held his hand quietly, telling myself I had been right to open my heart again. On the flight back, I looked out the window and saw pine trees blanketed in white snow. I thought to myself sometimes just a small invitation, just a simple getaway can be enough to bring people closer. I knew then that I hadn't only become the woman Dan loved. I had also become the bridge that helped his father rediscover the love of family, no matter how late. Later that year, when snow blanketed rooftops and strings of golden lights wrapped around the city, our wedding took place at a small resort in the mountains. It wasn't the grandest place, but every detail felt like something out of a fairy tale: white flowers, rustic wood, soft candlelight, and crisp mountain air full of warmth. I wore the white dress my mother had left in her old chest, slightly altered, simple, yet pure. My father was the one who walked me down the aisle. When his calloused hand rested in mine, tears filled my eyes. Daniel waited at the end of the aisle with his father beside him. His gaze was no longer that of a CEO. It was the look of a man who knew for sure that he had found home. He took my hand and read his vows, not grand promises, but simply a pledge to always be honest and to stand by me whenever our faith or kindness might be tested. And I made the same promise. I vowed never to forget that afternoon by the old plastic bench where a stranger asked for nothing, only a few minutes to listen, and unknowingly led me to the love of my life. Because of that small act of kindness I have today.